You're in your early 20s, newly independent, stepping into a small shared apartment that feels like both freedom and responsibility compressed into a few rooms. You live with a roommate you are not close friends with, but not enemies either. You are both practical adults trying to make something work. To avoid tension, you sit down early and agree on rules. Everything is divided clearly. Who cleans what? Who buys which supplies? When the trash goes out? When the floors are cleaned? And how the dishes are handled. The agreement feels fair and rational. You decide to split dish duty evenly. One of you handles it at the end of the week, the other midweek. It is simple, clean, efficient. At first, the system works exactly as intended. You do your part. When your day arrives, your roommate does theirs on their day. The sink stays empty. The kitchen feels neutral, functional, calm. For a brief moment, cooperation feels natural and effortless. Then something small breaks. One evening, you come home tired. You glance into the kitchen and see a sink full of dirty dishes on a day that is not yours. You pause. You say nothing. You assume there is a reason. Maybe work ran late, maybe tomorrow. You give the benefit of the doubt. That choice feels kind, reasonable, even mature. But days pass. When your own day arrives again, the pile is no longer small. It is excessive. Plates stacked on plates, utensils scattered, residue dried onto surfaces. Your roommate never addressed it. You hesitate. You could leave it, you could make a point, or you could quietly do it and keep the peace. You choose the third option. You clean everything. The kitchen resets. You tell yourself this is a one-time correction. You rationalize that consistency matters more than conflict. The following week, things appear normal again. Your roommate does their share. You feel relieved. Then it happens again. The sink fills. You ask about it directly this time. You are assured it will be handled. It is not. The mess grows day after day. Now the problem is no longer about dishes. It is about patterns. It is about expectations. It is about what your actions signal. You start asking questions that feel larger than the situation. If you clean again, what lesson are you teaching? If you do not, how bad will things get? Are you being cooperative or are you being trained? This is not just domestic frustration. This is strategy. This is a repeated interaction where every move changes the future. What you are experiencing is a lived version of a core problem studied in game theory. Game theory is not about games in the casual sense. It is about structured decision-making under interdependence. It studies situations where your outcome depends not only on what you do, but on what others choose to do in response. The dishes are just the surface. Underneath is a strategic interaction with incentives. In this situation, cooperation means following the agreement. Defection means ignoring it. Each of you benefits individually from defecting because you save time and effort. But if both of you defect, the shared environment degrades. The rational temptation conflicts with the collective good. This structure mirrors what is known as the prisoner's dilemma. In its simplest form, two players choose independently whether to cooperate or defect. Mutual cooperation leads to a good outcome for both. Mutual defection leads to a bad outcome for both. But unilateral defection gives one player a short-term advantage. The dilemma exists because rational self-interest pushes toward defection, even though cooperation would be better overall. In one-off interactions, the logic is straightforward. If you only play once and never again, the safest move is defection. You protect yourself from being exploited. There is no future to damage. This is why in isolated encounters, trust often collapses. But real life is almost never one-off. You live with your roommate tomorrow, next week, next month. The game repeats and repetition changes everything. In repeated games, strategy matters more than individual moves. You are no longer just choosing what benefits you now, but what shapes the other person's behavior over time. Every decision becomes a signal. When you clean the dishes that first time, you send a message. Perhaps unintentionally, you communicated that violations might be absorbed without consequence. When you asked politely and then still cleaned later, you reinforced it. The roommate's behavior did not emerge randomly, it adapted. Game theory studies this adaptation. Studies. It asks what strategies succeed not in a single round, but across many rounds with the same opponent. It turns out that being purely selfish is rarely optimal long-term, but neither is being endlessly accommodating. The core insight is that effective strategies balance cooperation with enforcement. They reward good behavior and punish bad behavior in a predictable way. This is where the idea of strategic reciprocity comes in. Instead of always cooperating or always defecting, you respond to what the other person does. You start cooperatively to invite trust. If cooperation is returned, you continue. If defection appears, you respond proportionally. This creates a feedback loop. The other person learns that their choices have consequences. Crucially, this only works if your responses are consistent and understandable. If you punish randomly or forgive endlessly, the signal becomes noise. The other player cannot learn how to interact with you. In your kitchen, the uncertainty is now high. Your roommate does not know if failing to do dishes will be ignored, forgiven, or resisted. You also do not know how far they will push. This uncertainty is costly for both of you. It creates tension and resentment. Game theory predicts that such unstable patterns tend to collapse into persistent defection unless corrected. In contrast, stable cooperation emerges when expectations are clear. This is why the initial agreement worked. Both of you knew the rules and followed them. The breakdown occurred when enforcement disappeared. At this point, your decision matters more than ever. If you clean again without addressing the behavior, you further weaken the incentive to cooperate. If you leave the mess indefinitely, you risk mutual defection and a degraded living space. The optimal strategy lies between these extremes. It involves clear communication, proportional response, and a willingness to restore cooperation once behavior improves. This is not about moral superiority. It is about shaping incentives. In strategic terms, you want to make cooperation the best option for the other player. That means cooperation must lead to a better outcome than defection over time. In repeated interactions, the future acts as leverage. The possibility of future cooperation is what makes cooperation rational now. If the other player believes that defection will reliably trigger negative consequences in the future, defection becomes less attractive. If they believe cooperation will be met with cooperation, trust can stabilize. This dynamic scales far beyond apartments. It appears in business partnerships, workplace norms, friendships, negotiations, and international relations. Whenever people interact repeatedly, the same structure emerges. Short-term exploitation competes with long-term stability. The question is never whether cooperation is good in theory. It is whether it can survive contact with self-interest. Game theory shows that it can, but only under certain conditions. There must be repeated interaction. Actions must be observable. Responses must be timely and proportional, and forgiveness must be possible once cooperation resumes. Without forgiveness, interactions spiral into endless retaliation. Without retaliation, exploitation dominates. Effective strategy sits precisely in the middle. In the coming batch, this framework expands beyond intuition into formal experimentation. Researchers did not just speculate about these strategies, they tested them. Through simulations of repeated dilemmas, they observed which strategies thrived and which collapsed. The most successful strategies were not the most aggressive or the most complex. They were the most clear, consistent, and fair. They treated cooperation as the default, but never as an obligation. They enforced boundaries without vengeance and restored trust without hesitation. These findings explain not only how to handle your roommate, but how cooperation emerges in competitive worlds at all. To understand why some approaches succeed in repeated conflicts and others fail, researchers turned the problem into something measurable. Instead of debating ethics or personality, they asked a colder question. If you run many repeated interactions between many different types of decision makers, which patterns actually accumulate the best results? In game theory terms, this is about strategies in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. where the same two players meet again and again, and each round you must choose between cooperation and defection. The key difference from a single encounter is that the future exists. Your action today changes what happens tomorrow, because your opponent can respond. That one detail turns the whole system from a simple protect yourself problem into a shape the relationship problem. In the late 20th century, a well-known political scientist organized a famous tournament to test strategies in exactly this scenario. Scholars and programmers were invited to submit rule-based strategies, each represented as a simple decision program. Every strategy would face every other strategy repeatedly. Points were awarded each round. If both cooperated, both got a solid reward. If one defected while the other cooperated, the defector got a bigger reward and the cooperator got nothing. If both defected, both got a small reward. The numbers differ across descriptions, but the structure stays the same. Betrayal pays more than cooperation in the short term, yet mutual betrayal is worse than mutual cooperation. When the tournament ran, many expected the winner to be aggressive, complicated, and exploitative. Some strategies were designed to probe for weakness, then harvest the advantage. Others tried to use unpredictability, occasionally defecting to keep opponents off balance. Others tried elaborate memory rules, tracking long histories to decide whether an opponent was trustworthy. And then there were strategies that were almost embarrassingly simple, with rules you could write on a sticky note. The surprising result was that the top performers were generally not the nastiest or the most intricate. The winners tended to be strategies built around one core principle: reciprocal cooperation. The most famous among them can be expressed in a single sentence. Begin by cooperating, then do whatever your opponent did last round. That is it. No elaborate psychology, no long-term plotting, no clever traps, just a steady rule. I will treat you the way you treat me, starting from goodwill. This approach is often called tit for tat. To see why it works, you need to look at the incentives that repetition creates. In a one-time situation, defection is attractive because you can grab the extra reward without fear of payback. In a repeated situation, defection triggers a response. You may win one round, but you can lose future rounds because your opponent stops trusting you. Repetition turns reputation into currency. If you defect, you are not just taking points. You are also damaging the future value of cooperation. The reciprocal strategy exploits this by making its behavior extremely easy to predict. Cooperate with me and I will cooperate with you. Betray me and you will immediately lose the benefits of my cooperation. Importantly, it does not escalate beyond what happened. If you defect once, it defects once. If you return to cooperating, it returns immediately as well. This is not endless punishment. It is a proportional consequence that resets the moment the other side resets. That balance is the whole secret. It invites long-term cooperation by making it profitable and stable, while simultaneously making exploitation unprofitable because it is instantly answered. In game theory terms, it is both nice and retaliatory. It does not start fights, but it does not absorb harm without response. It also has a third property that matters just as much. It is forgiving. If your opponent defects due to a mistake, misunderstanding, or a temporary crisis, the relationship does not become permanently poisoned. The moment they cooperate again, the reciprocal strategy cooperates again. That forgiveness is not sentimentality, it is a stability mechanism. Without forgiveness, systems drift into permanent defection. One mistake causes retaliation, the retaliation causes counter-retaliation, and the cycle never ends. Forgiveness is the exit ramp. There is also a fourth property, clarity. The opponent can quickly understand what is happening. Many complex strategies fail not because they are weak, but because they are unreadable. When your rules are opaque, others cannot adapt toward cooperation because they cannot tell what triggers your responses. Clarity allows learning. Over many rounds, other strategies discover that cooperation with this player yields consistent mutual reward, and that defecting only causes their own payoff to collapse into the low, ugly world of mutual defection. This is why reciprocal cooperation can do well in a tournament environment. It does not need to dominate every opponent one-on-one. It only needs to reliably earn high points with cooperative opponents while preventing persistent exploitation by defectors. Across an ecosystem of many strategies, this often creates the best total score. That is also why the approach feels so relevant to real life. It maps to a practical temperament. Start cooperative, respond proportionally when boundaries are crossed, and then return to cooperation the moment the other party shows willingness to cooperate again. Another variation that often performs even better in noisy environments is a slightly more generous version. In real life, actions are not always perfectly observed, and mistakes happen. Maybe someone meant to cooperate but failed due to stress, confusion, or miscommunication. In a noisy world, pure tit-for-tat can get trapped in a loop of retaliation over accidents. A generous tit-for-tat sometimes forgives a defection even when it could retaliate, specifically to prevent these spirals. It still punishes repeated defection, but it occasionally absorbs a single offense as a way to preserve the possibility of returning to stable cooperation. In other words, it sacrifices a small amount of short-term payoff to protect long-term cooperation from collapsing due to randomness. This is one of the most important game theory lessons. The best strategy in a messy world is not a perfect enforcer. It is an enforcer with just enough tolerance to prevent runaway conflict. Now bring this back to your kitchen. Your roommate defected by not doing the dishes. You responded with cooperation by cleaning them anyway. In game theory terms, you made defection profitable. You removed the cost that would normally discourage it. The roommate learned, even if subconsciously, that failing to do the task produces no immediate downside. That pushes the system toward a stable pattern where you do more work and they do less. The cooperative outcome collapses because the incentives no longer support it. The way to restore cooperation is not to become permanently hostile, but to restore proportional consequence and clarity. You want a predictable rule? When you skip your responsibility, the outcome is not that I silently fix it while you benefit. The outcome is that you lose something you value or face a cost you prefer to avoid. In a household context, the cost should not be cruelty. It should be a clear boundary that makes cooperation the better option. That can take many forms. It could be you only wash your own dishes, not theirs. It could be chores are rebalanced, so the person who skipped dishes takes an extra responsibility later. It could be if a task is skipped, it must be done before shared spaces are used for cooking again. The exact mechanism is less important than the strategic properties. It must be consistent, immediate enough to connect cause and effect, proportional to the offense, and reversible the moment cooperation resumes. This is also why vague frustration often fails. If you tolerate failures repeatedly and then explode emotionally later, you are mixing total forgiveness with sudden extreme punishment. Strategically, that is the worst of both worlds. It teaches the other person they can defect safely for a long time, and then it introduces unpredictable emotional backlash that makes the relationship unstable. Predictable consequence is not coldness, it is a communication system. It teaches the other person how to interact with you. Game theory also explains something uncomfortable. Many people interpret unlimited niceness as weakness, not because they are evil, but because in repeated interactions, behavior adapts to incentives. If the environment rewards defection, defection spreads. If it rewards cooperation, cooperation becomes stable. This is not a statement about human goodness. It is a statement about feedback loops. Your role in the loop matters because your responses change the payoff structure. If you want a cooperative equilibrium, you must make cooperation pay and make defection cost. At the same time, you must leave a door open for cooperation to return. Otherwise, you create a permanent war. The deeper takeaway is that not every interaction is a battlefield where you should maximize immediate advantage. In repeated games, trying to win the round can reduce total gains across time. Sometimes the most effective way to do well overall is to accept small short-term losses in service of a stable, cooperative future. That does not mean being a pushover. It means prioritizing sustainable outcomes over momentary victories. The reciprocal strategies that perform best do not chase dominance. They chase stability that benefits them repeatedly. They cooperate when cooperation is available. They punish when punishment is needed. And they forgive when forgiveness restores a higher value pattern. If you apply that to your own situation, the path becomes clearer. You start with cooperation because it offers the highest shared payoff. You enforce boundaries quickly when cooperation is violated, because otherwise violations become the norm. You keep the enforcement proportional and transparent, because clarity prevents confusion and escalation. And you forgive the moment the other side returns to cooperation, because the goal is not permanent resentment. It is a stable, workable system. In a world full of repeated interactions, the most effective strategy is not endless kindness, not endless aggression, and not elaborate manipulation. It is a simple rule that makes you easy to work with and hard to exploit.